Okay, today I want to go over a couple basic items that will go into your final rendered images for this particular assignment. I realize I think in my own personal desire to move past this part of the project, I was wanting to skip ahead so that we can get going on the next phase of this assignment. But I do realize that Glenn had a few gems tucked in his preparation for the final assignment. So I wanted to make sure we touched on that today so that we've got you in a good place. I was debating whether to talk about UVs, but I think I'll go ahead and address those briefly today so that we can introduce them to you, and then we'll get you going on your final images. I know there's a big anatomy exam today too, so hopefully this stuff will be light and easy to take in, and you'll be able to take a break after to get on to your exams and study or whatever you need to do. Um, so we're looking at the yes, thank you. Sorry. It's the ghost of Glenn. There we go. Thanks. So we've got our vertebrae in progress here. We've got some colors on there. One of the things that we will talk about are balancing out the values of your colors. So we'll get to that in a moment. But before we go too far with that, I do want to talk briefly about UVs and what that means as far as texture mapping. So in the example that Glenn put together, and we can take a look here, there's a video, UV mapping basics, where Glenn goes over some key points. Hopefully I can reproduce that here quickly for you. The idea with UVs is simply that when a polygon's created, there are directional components to that polygon. Let's take a look here. The center or the origin polygon is a mathematical point that has XYZ values. And then you have a base that's created, and that face has something called a normal. You just see so we can see them. Okay. So a polygon has a direction. That direction is referred to as a normal. And if I look at the single polygon, it basically is one square. Okay. Can be rectangular, but it's basically a four-sided object that has a direction. And the way I got the direction to show up is I went over under display and polygons, and there's something called face normals over here. If I select that, it will go away. If I select it again, it will return. It's not critical right now, but it's important from the standpoint that you understand that a polygon has a surface that faces out and then a backside to that surface. And often in Maya, you'll see that when you first create your polygons, you'll see it show up as black for the side that's facing away from the normal, and it will be shaded on the side that's facing the normal, or that is the facing direction of the polygon. you basically then have four vertices that define the edge, that define the face. And if you'll remember back to our component conversation, all of the selections, here's our face, here's our edge that we can select, and here's our vertex. Okay, so we've got four vertices, four edges, one face defines a polygon. The term U and V have to do with the direction of the polygon. I'm just going to turn off our normals here. And U basically goes in one direction and V goes in another direction. And I personally don't spend a lot of time trying to figure that out when I'm creating something. I just look at it and know that there is a directional component to the polygon. So that said, let's go back to the next thing that we wanted to take into consideration, and that's simply the relative value of color when you're looking at your rendered images and presenting them to people. So let's go here and I'm just going to round out the colors on our vertebrae. Again, I'm in the workspace just hitting the tab key to bring up my box to type into, and then I'm making shaders for each of the components that we still need to color map. And I'm arbitrarily grabbing colors here. We'll fine tune these in a moment, but I just want to be able to keep track of them visually. So let's assign these shaders. Again, I'm right clicking on the object, looking at the name. You can shift select to when you're doing the assigning, so you can assign both. Okay, so we've got some colors on here. If I render this right now, there's no lights in the scene, so we need to add some lights. Let's do that quickly, following our concept of adding a dome light for the ambient light, and remembering that we have to set the camera to 0 on that and adjust our intensity. And then we need to add an area light as our key light. And with that light, we need to set normalize off. And oops. And we can add a secondary fill light or bounce light. In order to bring some uniform color into the scene in a way that it bounces or fills the reflective component. And we'll turn normalize off for that, and we can maybe reduce the intensity a little bit. And then the last thing, if you'll recall, thinking about the general direction of the light rays that are coming from these lights, the spread is something that we can adjust in order to sharpen up or crisp up the shadows a little bit with these lights. And if we do a quick render now, we should see the object. It's showing up as white right now because I've got this set on the alpha channel, which is your 4th channel. But if I look at my RGB values here, you can see that I've got the colors reflected based on what I just rendered. So I'm going to save this. And then we'll take a look at how to, we'll review how to get this into Photoshop. So I'm going to set my render. And we're going to save this image. And I'm just going to send it to the desktop. And remember, let's see. Remember that we need to type in the suffix to get this into Photoshop. So we can either save it as a TIFF, which will give us a floating layer, or we could save it as a .exr, which would give us the image on black, but give us a channel that we can cut the image out with. So I'm going to, in this demo, use the EXR so we can talk about channels, but a .tiff will look fine as well. If you don't type your suffix when you save it, you'll end up with a JPEG, and you'll have to cut the background out by using other tools in Photoshop. So let's look at Photoshop. Like I said, I'm going to make just one more point here, and then I'll turn the reins over to Alan so that he can take you on a walking tour of graphic design and layout and get you ready to produce your final piece here. So we'll go with we'll open this file, which should be on our desktop. Come on. Where did it? Right. So when this file comes in again from an EXR format, you have channels RGB, which are the combined values of the red, green, and blue channel. And then you also have an alpha mask here that looks black and white. Okay. I'm going to duplicate this layer just for the goal of creating a separate layer from the background. My background layer is locked, but I will grab a color, turn off my alpha channel so you can see that. Grab a color and I'm going to fill the base layer so that you can see what's happening. If I turn this off now, you can see my rendered image is floating over a base layer. And now we need to get rid of the black background on this. So I'm going to use my alpha channel as a selection. And by going under select load selection, comes up with this option box. And if I select alpha 1, and in this case, I want to invert it because I'm trying to get rid of the black. So my alpha now is selecting the black area. And if I hit delete or backspace, I can get rid of the black, and you can see that our image now is floating. Our rendered image of the vertebrae is floating over the background. All right. Yeah, it's just naming things so we can keep track of them. And the point that Glenn is trying to make with the value system that you choose for your vertebrae is that if you take a look at the colors right now, you can see differences between the colors, which help inform you as the viewer as to what geometry represents what structure for the vertebrae. But if we take this color layer and go to our hue and saturation editor, and we reduce the saturation of our object, you can see that these colors all, the value of these colors all start to blend together. Okay, we've got a little difference with the spinous process, but what seemed easy to interpret with color now becomes a little more challenging if you remove that color and only look at the values. So this is a good test to sort of go through as you're thinking about how you separate objects, not just by color, but also by the value. If I had to say label the transverse process here and also label the lamina and have the values be different, you would have to make some different color choices in order to get those objects to separate visually. Okay, whereas if you're solely relying on color, it's pretty clear. But taking a moment to take your color renders and look at the values and look at how they differentiate between the objects and the values is also an important step to go through, particularly if you're designing work for somebody that has challenges seeing color. The most common being a red-green color blindness, where somebody looking at this might see the lamina and the spinous process as the same value and not be able to discern between the two surfaces. Okay. So we've brought our file into Photoshop. We've tested the value. And I think that's an assignment. That's part of the assignment, is to turn in a grayscale version of your vertebrae, if I'm remembering that correctly. So you would do that by bringing your colored image into Photoshop, opening hue saturation and reducing the saturation so that you can look at a desaturated version of your render. And then lastly, and Alan will get into this in more detail, so I'm not going to go into this heavily, but the last thing then, by separating out your rendered images within the Photoshop frame, we're going to have you design some slides that reflect how you might put these images together. Okay. And last thing I promise before I turn this over to Alan is that you may decide that you want to create an intervertebral disc and stack your vertebrae together. So if we take our vertebrae, which is grouped, and we duplicate that, in this case, I used Shift D to duplicate that object. I can move it up here. Let's reframe our scene just a little bit. Give ourselves a new bookmark. So that we can go back to that. And something else that's useful here is in your channel box layer editor tab over here, you can see a little empty space down here. If I create a new layer, in this case, they call it empty layer now. If I create a new layer, I can take my duplicated vertebrae, assign it to this layer, and I can toggle that visibility on and off by clicking on the V. This just can be helpful as you're working. You want to get rid of something so you can see what you're doing. We can name this layer. You can even color code it, which sometimes can be helpful if you've got a lot of grouped objects in a scene. And I'm also going to go under Show in my viewport window, and I'm just going to turn off Show Lights by unchecking it. That will get the lights out of our way too, so we can work on our scene. So hiding the top vertebrae, I'm going to go into my lower vertebrae, select the body, duplicate that. I'm going to unparent that, which will take it out from underneath the group. Okay, so I opened up, I selected the body, I duplicated it, and then I unparented it to bring it outside of our group. And because this is roughly the same size as the body, it's a duplicate of it, I'm just going to scale this down a little bit, position it. Maybe do an overall scale to reduce it just a little bit. like so. And then there is, with your vertebral discs, there is a nucleus to that as well. We could duplicate this further and scale it so that we end up with an inner surface in addition to the outer surface. And Glenn's got a great story in his little video about how uh, his nucleus pulposus of his disc managed to spring free and cause him several months of incapacitation. So you can go listen to that story if you like. And then lastly here, we'll grab our shading group for the disc. And we'll grab one for the nucleus. Come out here, make our assignments, right click, disk, right click, disk nucleus. And if I go to my shader, now that's part of the attribute editor over here, I can grab the shader tab. Let's give this a random color for now. The one thing that I'll do differently is that I'm going to open up the transmission tab and give some weight to the transmission of the object, which will make it slightly transparent. The higher the value there, the more transparent that is. And then we'll take our disk nucleus, go to a slightly different color, and you can decide if you want that to be transparent as well. If I look at this now, you can see how we have some transparency to the disk, and we have the inner pulposus, nucleus pulposus of the disk, rendered a little less transparently because we didn't adjust that value. I can go back to my layer editor, turn the top vertebrae on. I can maybe adjust the direction of this so we can see a little bit more of the disc and make our final stacked render. Okay. Again, saving this. We need to remember to type our suffix and make sure we put that in the right location. And from here, you'll be able to take this into Photoshop and Illustrator and work on your final layout. All right. It took a little longer than I had planned. I apologize for that, but we're going to take a break to stop this recording.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up where Craig left off here with talking about designing your assignment layouts for this class, and particularly with this first assignment. So what I'm going to do is walk through this PowerPoint that Glenn had initially designed, but then kind of walk you through um, how to start kind of laying this out in terms of typography and leader lines. And one of the things that is going to be mentioned is you probably want to do your layout first in Photoshop, bringing your EXR files from Maya into there and getting it kind of aligned in a certain way, and then bringing it into Illustrator because it'll be obviously a higher quality with the typography, the export with that, as opposed to Photoshop, but also it'll give you the opportunity to kind of fine tune and adjust things. So one of the first things that Glenn mentions is this rule of thirds and having creating this grid in a sense to kind of space out your image. And I might try to kind of pull that up in Photoshop just to show you. But also I'll show possibly just the grids, just how to bring up the rulers to kind of create that if this is confusing at all for anybody. And this will kind of just help place your images and renders kind of in an interesting way, so it's not so center focused, and it kind of helps kind of create more visual interest in your composition. Um, this isn't necessarily like a rule or just something to necessarily follow, but it helps for good just design and overall layout in terms of kind of thinking about the composition and kind of keeping the viewer on the page. And so I might actually switch windows just to kind of show where this is. In Photoshop, to create these different artboards or guides, you're going to go to Photoshop, Settings, Guides, Grids, and Slices to kind of create that 3-point system. So for in Photoshop, if I could find it, it's under Preferences, Guides, Grids, and Slices. And this will look very much like the slide um, from my courses here. And what you can do with this to create that kind of perfect, use of thirds to help with your layout is you can create a grid with that 33.3%, so it keeps it in thirds. So with that in Photoshop, I'm going to change this to percent. And it's going to be 33.3%. And I'm just going to keep the subdivisions to 3. And we don't see anything right now because I don't have it viewing. But I just wanted to kind of point out where that setting is, just to kind of, if you're at Photoshop here on campus or at home, this helps create that division in the canvas. So this is the next question is how do I see that? So in order to see that grid, you're going to go to View, Show, and you're going to show your grid lines or guides, and that's going to be just under View, Show, Grid, and you can see. Let me put the background color on. You can see that it's got those divisions or those guides in terms of that spacing in terms of thirds. Now, right now, many of you, at least from what me and Craig have seen in class, you're very close or you're just about ready to get your renders composited or bringing them together. And one of the important things about that is you don't want to just kind of place them randomly in the file. You want to really think about the spacing, the sizing, and you want to create really individual layers for each image as you bring those in. So as Glenn has in this slide here, he has the text on separate layers. This part we're going to do in Illustrator per se, but in Photoshop, I would recommend bringing in this particular case, the lateral, anterior, and a perspective 3/4 view into your layout. So when you're doing that, you're gonna bring in 3 separate EXR files kind of combined into one PSD or TIFF layout. And the reason for that is just so it kind of helps with spacing and kind of really creating individual renders, but bringing them in a unique way. And this slide is just basically saying what Craig has already mentioned, is just having the 3 TIFF or EXR files and just bringing them together, combining them in a PSD file, giving them a unique name, and helping kind of construct the overall layout for your schematic vertebrae. One thing to just keep in mind, and fairly certain this is good, is you want to keep the size consistent. So we were rendering from Maya and pixels. I would just change the um, units to pixels just so it keeps it all consistent. So what I did was I went to image size, and right now it's showing it as inches, but I'm going to just change it to pixels just so it keeps it consistent from what you're rendering from Maya in terms of just that continuity. You can also, in preferences, if you go to units and rulers, you could, and it's already looks like it's set here to pixels, so it'll keep that unit of measurement consistent from Maya into Photoshop in terms of just keeping it that web resolution there. Click OK. Now, right now, you really want to think about just obviously color. You want to definitely, as Craig was showing, really think about the values, not only working with the color hues you selected in Maya, but also how does it look in grayscale? Is it holding up the different um, materials and objects? Are they showing up okay in terms of those different renders? Or do you maybe have to go back into Maya and fine tune those so they have particular hues or color values? And really these next couple slides are just showing Glenn really just kind of combining and bringing those renders into one layer. And labeling, as Craig has mentioned, is really important. You definitely want to, um, especially as these get more complicated, as we get into rendering the realistic vertebrae, we want to keep things in mind in terms of what the materials are, but also the particular vantage points or perspectives that you're seeing there. So, and it's pretty simple if you haven't used Photoshop before. It's just, I'm going to just call this um, perspective, but I'll undo it just to show that you can rename your layers as you bring them in from your separate EXR files. And as you kind of bring these together, you want to kind of have them kind of placed, in different places in terms of like the composition using that rule of thirds there. And so what Glenn's showing on this slide is that you want to have kind of a layer of, or file rather, with all of them combined. So whether they're stacked or you have the different vantage points, definitely save a specific Photoshop file with them all combined. They might not necessarily be kind of um, placed yet, but you just want to kind of have one with them all there. I'm just going to skip ahead a second, but this is it's gonna initially look like. You're gonna have all 3 of your renders together, and they're just gonna be kind of overlapping. We have the lateral, anterior, and the perspective view, but they're just kind of, I don't say willy-nilly, but they're just kind of there right now. And same here with this slide. It's just again, repeating that duplication, you're duplicating that layer to a new document. So if you're unsure of where that is in Photoshop, so let's just make I'm going to duplicate this layer to a new document.
How can you just isolate everything
Isolate the proof?
from the back?
What Craig just showed before?
Yeah, I'm,
Oh, okay. So when it's brought in, it's just, it has a black background, right? So to select it, you're gonna go to select, load selection, and you're gonna select the alpha channel. And from there, it's gonna select everything that was black in that selection. One of the things that you want to keep in mind when you're loading that selection is that it's inverted too, because otherwise it's going to just select the opposite. You're welcome. But does that make sense? Just you're going to duplicate all your layers, all your individual EXR files into one PSD file. And on my courses, I'm gonna kind of start you guys off with just some techniques or thoughts with labeling. There are some examples. It's called schematic vertebrae examples. And there's past student examples, both labeled and unlabeled. So I'm going to go here a second, and I'm just going to download one of them to bring into Illustrator in just a second, just to kind of play with leader lines and title text and labels. So I'm going to go back to Glenn's PowerPoint a second and just talk about that a little bit. You definitely want to think about the scale, the size of your images rendered, and you want to make them really unique. You don't want them to be kind of all equal in terms of size or placement. You want to really think about scale variation, so it doesn't overcrowd the viewer, but it definitely it makes it really easy to follow, but also understand in terms of a learning perspective. And in Photoshop, let's say we have, we'll pretend these are different views just for. So notice that even though we're going to pretend these are different angles, but they're all the same right now, that they're not all the same size. And I'm thinking about how close they are to the edges too. One thing I do is I tend to do view and I do show, see it on here, but I tend to put my rulers on and show, there you go. And I tend to use guides just to kind of help really give a little bit of space to the edges. So I know I'm not particularly close to any of the corners of the image. But also kind of accounting for, if we were to print this, that, wouldn't get cut off in printing, that it wouldn't be so close to the edge that some of your artwork or renders wouldn't be showing there. So in terms of like, what you're doing for this project, I'm giving like around like a 50 pixel, like just kind of border all the way around, just to kind of help with the spacing, just so your title, your leader lines, or your labels aren't so close to the edges. And I'll show you guys how to do this in Illustrator too. One thing with these guides now is I can also, using that grid we created, really stick to that, that rule of thirds, that it really keeps it in line with those three kind of columns or guides there. Again, you're not kind of, you have to do that necessarily, but it definitely helps in terms of your readability and your layout with that. And that's basically what Glenn is talking about right here, is that, you're thinking about transforming, scaling your renders. I was just holding the shift key when scaling them down just to kind of keep them in proportion. Although you could, if you're uncomfortable with the shortcut, you could just go to Edit, Transform, Scale, and it'll give you those options to scale it down that way too. And right now, like all our grid lines are all the same color or hue. If we go to our preferences, so maybe the artboard ones I'll change to, they don't appear different, but. So I'm going under Edit, Preferences, Guides, Grids, and Slices, and let me try like magenta so it pops out. Definitely being wonky, but I do want to just point out that you can change the color in there, and just, as a reminder of where to kind of set up that rule of thirds. That's under Edit, Preferences, Guides, Grids, and Slices. And the grid part, again, is just under the grid line every 33.3%. And if it was, maybe you don't have the right setting, but you can change the colors of it too, if you want to change a particular grid line to show up, or versus the rulers that I have in place here. So now we have, in this slide, we have three different views. We have them kind of laid out in an interesting way. And notice that there's a bit of space kind of all the way around. There's plenty of room for a title. There's room for leader lines and labels. But one of the things that Glenn mentions is that you don't necessarily have to have a title, but you definitely should have labels. I might recommend still having a title because it's good practice. I think it's good just to start to think about where all those things are going to be placed in terms of your overall layout. And also one of the things I want to kind of show next is when you have a finished like starting point for your piece, I would do the text in Illustrator. And the reason why is Photoshop is a raster-based program. It's seeing things in pixels as opposed to um, Illustrator that sees it in vector. And part of the reason why that we're going to do that is it keeps the quality of your typography and your leader lines nice and crisp. And if you export it from Photoshop, let's say you did do the text in Photoshop, it would render out slightly pixelated. It might not be the quality you were looking for. So that's why I'm recommending bringing it into Illustrator to add the labels and text and whatnot. And you know, it's interesting because I was talking with Craig about this morning, that this is something I was mentioning to a lot of the fourth years actually last week. A lot of these same principles, I was reminding them in terms of just some common techniques or suggestions. Serif typefaces are a little difficult to read. They tend to have kind of like those little accents kind of on the words and whatnot. Those are good for titles or headers, obviously, but your labels or or lines rather should be sans serif. And I'm going to show you guys a couple examples of those in Illustrator, just so you know what the difference is between those. For these images for your project, you want to create the labels around 12 to 14 points, and the headings 16 to 20 points, or pixels rather. If these are going to be for print, it would be 8 to 12 or 12 to 16 point for the text and labels, and for the header respectively. And one of the really important things is you want to think about the intended audience for your topic. Is it for kind of more a contemporary or modern audience? These would be probably seen on the web or on your website. Probably a sans serif would be kind of a recommendation in terms of type choice. If it's more, you're going for more of a formal, classical style, probably more of a serif type choice. Your lead lines, you want them to be overall thinner than the lowercase I of your font. You want it to kind of separate from the values of your type, and you want to keep the angles consistent. So maybe if they're all angled a particular way, they're all consistent, or they don't vary too much just in terms of their readability. And it also helps in terms of just separating the headings and titles from the bodies and labels. And so right now in this image, we're just looking at, like, you have the title, we have obviously our various labels here, and they're just kind of placed. They don't necessarily have leader lines yet, but they're placed in terms of the overall like composition or placement in the page. And this is what I'm going to kind of briefly show in Illustrator is that you want to place, you could bring in your Photoshop file to add the lead lines as well. You can also export it as a TIFF, or you can bring it in as a PNG or JPEG. But for what you're doing with this project, you might as well bring in the Photoshop file. We have everything laid out where it is. It'll keep the names that you labeled everything brought into Illustrator as well. And it'll help kind of fine tune the exact positioning of the text in Illustrator. And even on the slide here, notice that I'm looking at kind of like the outer green outline and the inner green outline. Notice how the text tries to not kind of touch those edges there. It still keeps a good, I'm not exactly sure, but maybe 50 to, 25 to 75 pixels just kind of all the way around, just to keep that spacing there so the text isn't super close. Um, when you're drawing the leader lines, and I'll show this in a second, um, you can do it with probably the pen tool. There is a line tool as well, but it would be good practice maybe just to kind of do it with the pen tool, as it'll be something you'll learn and use in other projects in terms of the vector software. And notice how some of the leader lines that, they're very consistent. Um, in this example, that there's kind of a color correlation in terms of like the transverse process and the lamina. They're all really kind of tie in nicely, almost as a key in terms of where things are placed. Um, you don't necessarily have to do that, but it might be helpful if it is for you in terms of obviously learning and remembering, but also in terms of building that skill set there. Okay, so I'm going to go back to one of our unlabeled ones, which it downloaded as a PSD or a JPEG. Yep. So I'm going to open. Okay. Now, I think this is also a good point that I'll mention on behalf of Craig too, that will also be helpful. Part of the reason why Craig showed you guys that EXR file format is we want to have you guys create interesting backgrounds, whether it's just a gradient or a color. Um, try to avoid just solid black. I can't tell you how many times we've gotten to just a solid black background. Part of the reason why you're doing this is to start to think about the overall layout in terms of just, you know, what what it is that we're trying to focus on, but also how do I make this composition really interesting, and how do I make it stand out, even though it's just, an early project here. It's starting to really think about those design principles in terms of your overall composition and just uh, rising to the occasion with just keeping it all there. So one of the things I'm going to show in Illustrator is kind of pretty much the same thing that we were doing in Photoshop with the grid. So I'm going to do, I like to show rulers, so I'm going to put show rulers on. And it looks like it's in pixels, which is what we're looking for. But I will check just to be sure. So under Edit, Preferences, I'm going to look for the Guides and Grid. So unit, I'm going to change it to, it's actually points, but that's okay. We're going to change it to pixels. And let me see. So if we want to divide it in thirds, we want a grid line every 640 points. And I'll do it in 3 subdivisions. I'm gonna eyeball it right now, but definitely think about keeping that rule of thirds, bringing it into Illustrator, even still, with our layout here. I'm also going to they're a little close, but it's okay. I'm gonna still kind of add a little bit of a border just so looks like all the artwork is in there and it's good. It's not super close to the edge. So for looking at our layer here, it has our image, it has our guides. I'm just going to call this as our image right now. And whenever I'm doing type, I would do it on a separate layer, just kind of make a brand new layer, lock your initial image, and I'm going to just call this layer type text, whatever you want to call it, just so it just kind of separates it from the rest of your renders there. So in this downloaded version, we have our image set, we have our 3 views placed accordingly. The next thing we want to think about is our type, is like just some different options. So I'm gonna go to Window, and I'm just gonna look for type, and I'm gonna look for the character tab, and that's gonna show kind of our different typefaces or fonts that you could choose from. So I'm just going to draw out a text box real quick. And I'll make this maybe 20. I'm going to make it big just so you guys can see. Scam. Okay. Now a few things. So let's look at like Onyx here, and I'm just going to make this nice and big so you guys can see if it lets me do. Okay. This typeface is an example of a serif. Notice how it has these kind of accented shapes on the S and the C, those arced kind of shapes or designs. A lot of the type that you're going to be using are going to be Trigil Sans, more of a serif. So notice the difference right away that it doesn't have those accents. It's very clear and concise. And you see this a lot in terms of just overall, I mean, pretty much every day in terms of branding and advertising. You see this a lot, pretty much everywhere. There's a lot more sans serif than you really think about. And so the top part of the character tab is going to be your typefaces or your fonts that you're probably more familiar with. This side right here is the font size, and it's typically in points. And I'm also going to bring up another important thing is window color, the color tab here. And so right now, our type is black text on kind of a orange muted cream tone colored background. Now, black can be used for a lot of things. Sometimes it's makes sense. In this particular case, maybe I wouldn't go necessarily with a black color. I would change this to CMYK, and I'm going to eyedrop it, but then I'm going to adjust it. So let's do something. I'm not sold on that color, but we'll work with it for now. It's okay. So one of the things that Jim will mentioned is you want to have solid numbers for your CMYK. Now, this is going to be an RGB image that's on the web, that's on your portfolio, or you submit to us. But let's say you printed it for whatever reason. These kind of muddied values might be tricky for the printer, or they might not look so clear. So one thing to kind of adjust that is to have these as solid numbers. So I'm just gonna adjust these so they're 80, this is 50. So you can hardly notice the difference, but if it was printed, it would be a much more satisfying color in terms of print. That it would match the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black printer colors pretty well in terms of just how it's printed. Now, for this project, let's say you like Gill Sans. You're like, that's a great type choice or option. Some other ones that obviously Myriad Pro is kind of like a default one. Definitely take a look at what's available. You know, you have the whole Adobe suite in terms of for options of type choices. Um, Gill Sans, Helvetica is a good one. It's got a whole type family, Helvetica, which I don't see on here, which is strange, but Univir. This is their version of kind of Helvetica, but I'll go back to Gill Sans. When you're doing your layout, try to keep it to 2 to 3 fonts or typefaces. If you do over 3, it's too much. Most of the time, you're going to just choose one, and it's going to be one type family. It's going to be maybe the title is bold. But then our labels are just regular. And this helps in terms of just the hierarchy. We know that our title is going to be more important. So that's going to be kind of hyphenated or kind of more so highlighted specifically. Your labels, they're going to be kind of a secondary information, but still pertinent. So I'm just going to call this body for now. And as you're starting to lay this out, like you don't want your um, labels to be the same size as your header, obviously. So this will be, I'm just gonna make it this 48 point for right now. And maybe I'll go, yeah, maybe a brighter blue. 55, 20. So some places you might just kind of put the label kind of where it is that you're looking at. Now, let's say like for the lamina, we were just, let's go back to our slide a second. Notice how these leader lines are angled. It might be for what you're doing better that they're perpendicular or just kind of horizontal. So I'll show you guys how to do both, and you can kind of pick and choose when it's necessary or when it might be kind of pertinent to do so. So let's say for the lamina, I'm gonna do it here, just so you guys could see it. So what I'm doing is I'm just using the pen tool. And I'm gonna do it probably for a leader line, maybe black or white, and just keep it really consistent in terms of like what it is that you're doing that leader line on. Now, one thing to note is that, as it's going over a dark surface, you might decide that maybe it's better that it's white. So you could change the color, obviously here, but I would also look at window, stroke, and look at the stroke weight. 'Cause maybe it needs to be a little bit thicker just to see it easier. Sometimes you'll see kind of a leader line with um like kind of either an outline or a duplicate stroke underneath it just to help with readability. If it's kind of going over like a dark surface or whatnot, that's totally okay. And then I'm just using the shift key to kind of adjust how far that is. Now, with these compositions, you don't have a lot of space, so you definitely think about maybe they're not going to be too far away, and maybe there's only going to be a few particular leader lines there. So if I'm going to label this the lambda, well, the blue doesn't kind of make sense there. Now we could, maybe in this instance, maybe it's okay to have them just be black. That might be all right. Or maybe there's still um come on, I forgot which one. Maybe we want it to still be that brown hue that we selected earlier. It would remember it in your color palette here in your swatches. These look like little square shapes in your color palette here. Um, I tend to like if it's consistent, but maybe for your layout, you might actually like having the color corresponding. That might be okay. It just depends. Um, Now, let's say, I wasn't showing that lamina, but I was going over here. I'm going to pick our pen tool, and maybe it's better to do it kind of angled. I think that's okay too. That's all right. Again, it just depends where it is that you're kind of leading from. Um, the important thing to think about is obviously the stroke weight determines how thick it is. And I don't need a fill, just a stroke. Sometimes you'll see leader lines that it looks like this, almost like kind of an L shape. That's sometimes okay. It depends on like obviously the location of the structure and um, like how much space you have. But I was creating this with the pen tool to create these shapes for the leader lines. You can also, it should be under the shape tool here. Yep, there's a line segment tool. So you can use this one as well. Let's see, we're just gonna call this body. And I think too, sometimes with your leader lines, you'll see sometimes there's like a little dot just to kind of help with placement of those leader lines. And I just it was just second nature. I just went to the circle tool and just held down the shift key just to draw that circle. Again, sometimes it might be nice for consistency to kind of think about the color palette of your piece and tie it in that way. There's nothing wrong if it's just like white or black, but you might kind of play up the colors or hues you have in the piece. Make it match a little bit better. One thing I also want to mention is please put your name on these too. I know that sounds kind of silly and redundant to say, but when Craig and I are looking at these, it'll say the name on the file, but it's helpful if it says your actual name on there somewhere. It's very helpful when looking at these. Um, like don't make it obviously crazy big, but I'm just gonna call it. I'll put my name for a second, but for the assignment, put your full name. And maybe it's still within the kind of the borders, but it's either tends to be like in the lower left or right, just so we know who made what images or files here. Sometimes I've seen it as artwork by. That is not true for this demo. That's not correct, but I'm just so you guys know what it might, maybe artwork or renders by might be good too. Just put your name on it just so we know whose we're looking at. So just a few things from Illustrator just to take away. The header and the labels, you want them to be probably one typeface or family that usually works very well. Typically a serif. Look at what's kind of available here in Adobe to see what they have. Your header is going to tend to be a bit bolder than your body type or your labels. You can have two upwards to three typefaces as needed, but I tend to see a lot of them kind of within the same font family. It just makes it easier to follow and understand. Definitely think about how you translate that rule of thirds, that composition from Photoshop to Illustrator, and also think about how you might do your leader lines. They might be perpendicular, they might be angled. It all depends on how your layout is. Maybe they're all facing this way, just to give a comparison. But one thing too with the leader lines, try to give a nice space with your type or label so it's not super close, but it's not super far either. Like I probably wouldn't, you know, put that leader line there. It's just going right across, our other structures here. So definitely think about what makes sense and what is very easy to follow in terms of layout and composition. And if you're unsure about kind of the preferences, like the units of measurement or how to adjust those, either of us or the grads assistants can help you guys with that too, if you're unsure of how to do that. Any questions? About this or, yeah? Okay. I'll stop recording.